All right, we're going to go ahead and pick up with chapter 2 of Serafina and the Twisted Staff. A moment later, a sound in the distance tickled Serafina's ear. It wasn't sparrow wings, like she'd heard before, but something earthbound. She tilted her head and listened for it again. It seemed to be coming from down in the valley. She stood, faced the sound, and cupped her hands around the back of her ears, a trick she'd learned from mimicking a bat. She heard the faint jangle of harnesses and the clip clop of hoofs. Her stomach tightened. It was a strange sound to encounter in the middle of the night. A team of horses pulling a carriage was making its way up the 3 mile long winding road toward the house. In the daytime, there would be nothing unusual about that. But no one ever came to Biltmore at night. Something was wrong. Was it a messenger bearing bad news? Had someone died? Was the North going to war with the South again? What calamity had befallen the world? Pulling back from the rocky ledge, she hurried down into the valley and made her way through the forest to one of the arched brick bridges where the road crossed over the stream. She watched from the concealing leaves of the mountain laurel as an old, road-beaten carriage passed by. Most carriages had one or two horses, but this carriage was pulled by 4 dark brown stallions with powerful, bulging muscles, their hides glistening with sweat in the moonlight and their nostrils flaring. She swallowed hard. That isn't a messenger. Braden had told her that stallions were wild and notoriously difficult to deal with. They kicked their handlers and bit people and especially hated other stallions, but here were 4 of them pulling a carriage in unison. When she looked at who was driving the carriage, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The carriage bench was empty. The horses were all cantering together in a forceful rhythm as if by the rein of a master, but there was no driver to be seen. Serafina clenched her teeth. This was all wrong. She could feel it in her core. The carriage was heading straight for Biltmore, where everyone was fast asleep and had no idea it was coming. As the carriage rounded a bend and went out of sight, Serafina broke into a run and followed. She ran through the forest, tracking the carriage as it traveled down the winding road. The cotton dress Miss Vanderbilt had given her wasn't too long, so it was easy to run in, but keeping pace with the horses was surprisingly difficult. She tore through the forest, leaping over fallen logs and bounding over ferns. She jumped gullies and climbed hills. She took shortcuts, taking advantage of the road's meandering path. Her chest began to heave as she pulled in great gulps of air. Despite the trepidation she had felt moments before, the challenge of keeping up with the horses made her smile and then made her laugh, which made it all the more difficult to breathe when she was trying to run. Leaping and darting, she loved the thrill of the chase. Then, all of a sudden, the horses slowed. She pulled herself short and hunkered down. The horses came to a stop. She ducked beneath a clump of flowers a stone's throw from the carriage and concealed herself as she tried to catch her breath. Why is the carriage stopping? The horses anxiously shifted their hoofs and steam poured from their nostrils. Her heart pounded as she watched the carriage. The handle of the carriage door turned. She crouched low to the ground. The carriage door swung slowly open. She thought she could see 2 figures inside, but then there was a roll of darkness like she'd never seen before. A shadow so black and fleeting that it was impossible for even her eyes to make it out. A tall and sinewy man in a wide-brimmed leather hat and a dark, weather-beaten coat emerged from the carriage. He had long, knotty gray hair and a gray mustache and beard that reminded her of moss hanging from a craggy tree. As he climbed down from the carriage and stood on the road, he held a gnarled walking stick and gazed out into the forest. Behind him, a vicious-looking wolfhound slunk down from the carriage onto the ground, then another followed. The hounds had large, lanky bodies, massive heads with black eyes, and ratty, thick, blackish-gray fur. 5 dogs in all came forth from the carriage and stood together, scanning the forest for something to kill. Afraid to make even the slightest sound, Serafina took in a slow, ragged breath as carefully and quietly as she possibly could. The beat of her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run. Just stay still, she ordered herself. Stay very still. She was sure that as long as she didn't break cover, they wouldn't see her. She wasn't certain what it was, maybe his long frayed coat and the worn-up state of his carriage, but the man seemed as if he'd traveled a long distance. It surprised her when he shut the carriage door, stepped away, and looked at the horses. The stallions immediately broke into a run like they had been whipped. The carriage soon disappeared down the road, taking whoever remained inside onward toward Biltmore, but leaving the bearded man and his dogs behind in the forest. The man did not appear to be dismayed or upset by this, but acted as though the forest was exactly where he wanted to be. Saying words Serafina could not understand, the man gathered his pack of dogs around him. They were foul beasts with massive paws and thick claws. They didn't seem like normal dogs that sniffed the ground and explored the forest. They all looked up at their master as if waiting for his instructions. The man's face was shrouded by the bent brim of his hat, but when he tilted his head upward toward the moon, Serafina sucked in a breath. The man's silvery eyes glinted with power, peering out from his weathered, craggy face. His mouth came slowly open like he was trying to suck in the moonlight. Just when she thought he was going to utter words, he let out the most terrifying hissing scream she had ever heard. It was a long, raspy screech, and right at that moment, a ghostly white barn owl appeared out of the trees, flying overhead, the beat of its wings uttering silently. But then it answered the man's call with a blood-curdling scream in return. The sound sent a terrible burst of shivers down Serafina's spine, and as the owl flew by her, its eerie, flat-faced head pivoted toward her. As if searching, hunting, she ducked to the ground like a frightened mouse. As the owl disappeared into the midnight gloom, Serafina peeked back toward the road. Her heart stopped cold. The bearded man and his 5 hounds were now looking out into the forest in her direction. The man's eyes still gleaming with an unnatural light, despite the fact that he had turned away from the moon. She tried to convince herself that it was impossible for the man and his dogs to see her concealed in the leaves, but she couldn't shake the horrible fear that they knew exactly where she was. The ground beneath her seemed to become slippery with some unknown dampness. The ivy on the forest floor seemed to be moving. She heard a tick-tick-ticking sound followed by a long, raspy hiss. Suddenly, she felt the touch of the man's breath on the back of her neck, and she spun around, cringing violently, but there was nothing there but blackness. The man reached into his pocket with one of his knobby, leathery skinned hands and took out what appeared to be a scrap of torn, dark-colored cloth. "Breathe it in," he ordered his dogs, his voice low and sinister. There was something about the stranger's rugged face and beard, his rustic clothing, and the way he said his words that made her think he was an Appalachian man, born and raised in the rocky ravines and thorny coves of these very mountains. The first wolfhound pushed its muzzle into the folds of the dark cloth. When it drew its nose out again, its mouth gaped open, its teeth bared and chattering, dripping with saliva. The dog began to growl. Then the second dog and the third nosed the dark cloth until all 5 had taken the scent. The wicked, snarling malevolence of the hounds stabbed her stomach with the fear. Her only hope was that the trail of the cloth scent would take them in the opposite direction. The man looked down at his pack of hounds. "Our quarry is near," he told them, his voice filled with menacing command. "Follow the scent. Find the black one." Suddenly the dogs howled, savage like wolves. All 5 of them burst from their haunches and lunged into the forest. Serafina jumped despite herself. Her legs wanted to run so bad that she could barely keep herself still. But she had to stay hidden. It was her only chance to survive. But to her horror, the hounds were running straight toward her. She couldn't understand it. Should she keep hiding? Should she fight? Should she run? The dogs were going to tear her to pieces. Just when she knew she had to run, she realized it was too late. She didn't have a chance. Her chest seized, her legs locked, she froze in terror. No, don't do it. You're not a rat. You're not a chipmunk. You've got to move." Faced with certain death, she did what any sensible creature of the forest would do. She leapt 10 feet straight up into the tree. She landed on a branch, then scurried along its length and hurled herself like a flying squirrel in a desperate leap to the next tree. From there, she bounded to the ground and ran like the Dickens. With howls of outrage, the hounds gave chase, running and snapping at her. They cursed her like a pack of wolves on a deer. But they were wolfhounds, so they weren't born and bred to chase down and kill anything as small as a deer. They were born and bred to chase down and kill wolves. As she ran, Serafina glanced back over her shoulder toward the road. The craggy-faced man looked up at the owl as the haunting creature came circling back around. Then, to Serafina's astonishment, he threw his walking stick up into the sky. It tumbled end over end toward the owl, but it did not strike the bird. It seemed to blur and then disappear into the darkness, just as the owl flew into the cover of the trees. Serafina had no idea who the man was or what she had seen, but it didn't matter now. She had to run for her life. Fighting off a single jumping, biting, snapping, snarling wolfhound was bad enough, but fighting 5 was impossible. She sprinted through the forest as fast as she could, her muscles pinched with the power of fear. She wasn't going to let these growling beasts defeat her. The cold forest air shot into her pumping lungs, every sense in her body exploding with a lightning bolt of panic. Coming up behind her, the first hound reached out its ragged neck, opened its toothy maw, and bit the back of her leg. She spun and struck the dog, screaming in anger and searing pain as the dog's fangs punctured her flesh. The smell of the blood excited the hounds into even more of a frenzy. The second dog leaped up upon her and bit her shoulder, tearing into her with growling determination as she slammed her fist into its face. The third clamped its teeth onto her wrist as she tried to pull it away. The three then pulled her down and dragged her across the ground. Then the other two dogs came in for the kill, their fangs bared as they lunged straight for her throat.